which is on H.R. 4647. The chair now recognizes Mr. Fortenberry for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Ranking Member Hanabusa, thank you as well. Chairman Bishop, always a pleasure to see you and work with you. I want to first acknowledge my collaborative partner, Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, for her extraordinary leadership in this initiative. We are working very hard to create a bipartisan spirit around this bill because we think it's essential to our country's well-being, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to testify today. Mr. Chairman, last fall I stepped onto a boat in the Missouri River, and this is at the foot of the Great Plains. It's among the Missouri River bottoms, about 50 miles north of Omaha, and this is where the vast expanse of our country really does begin. And the reason I did that is we were there to look at a Corps of Engineers project. The Corps of Engineers about 100 years ago took on making the Missouri River navigable, and they made a series of calculations using the velocity of the water to actually create the conditions in which the channel would remain navigable. But over time, they did such a good job with their calculations, the river levels have dropped, and the land along the sides of the river, which hosted a number of species and habitats, has diminished. So now the Corps of Engineers is being forced to recreate the conditions for the spawning grounds of the pallid sturgeon. I went to look at this area, which is on the Iowa side of the river, and as we got a little bit closer to the weirs and rock barriers that were built in order to create shallow water for the pallid sturgeon, we ran aground in the sandy bottom. There was a little yellow sign in the distance on one of the sandbars, and I asked, "What is that?" Somebody had already gone out into this area of the river and claimed that spot for a duck hunting blind. The reason that I'm telling you all this is that by a holistic approach to restoration of wildlife habitat, by creating the conditions in which not only species can thrive, we create the conditions for tremendous recreational opportunity, hunting, fishing, and community well-being. And that fundamentally is the purpose of the bill here today, Recovering America's Wildlife Act. Mr. Chairman, I want to move from a system which is based on regulation and litigation to one that's based on collaboration. And as you're quite aware, the federal government mandates that each state have a state wildlife management plan, and yet we do not adequately fund those. And at the same time, we have about 8,000 species in America nearing an endangered status. And when the endangered species law is invoked, we move into the realm of not only regulation, but litigation and who benefits. It takes years to come up with suitable plans. It takes multiple levels of lawsuits and government engagement and waste of time and money for this country. There is a better way to do this, to create a proactive environment in which we at the federal level are collaborating with the states, funding an unfunded or not a fully funded mandate, and moving funds from resource extraction into resource recovery for the benefit of wildlife, for the benefit of hunters, for the benefit of fishermen, for the benefit of community. That's at its core what this bill is seeking to do. This has created a wave of excitement, which excites me, among the sportsman's community, among the conservation community, among state administrators of wildlife agencies, who see now the possibility for a continuity of habitat through voluntary agreements like we do in Nebraska and other places like Wyoming. I don't know exactly how it works in California. It might be a little different. So I'm trying to be sensitive to this. But at the same time, there are options here to use collaboration and partnership with landowners, farmers, and others to create the conditions for, again, continuity of habitat. Not only did I want to present today the options, the ideas in this bill, but I also wanted to thank you because it helps by having a platform to get appropriate feedback, some of which has come from my good friend, Congressman Garrett Graves, who has a very valid concern that oil and gas revenues substantially come from Louisiana and a very meager portion return back to a very serious, complex ecological conservation that he has in his backyard involving coastal erosion. I have stood on the remnant of shores in Louisiana looking at the rock piles erected by the community of Grand Isle in order to try to stop the pressures from the Gulf of further eroding their land and their wildlife habitat. I think he's brought up a reasonable concern in this regard, and I think as we move forward, we're actually looking for ways in which we could accomplish multiple objectives in this regard. You've brought
Gentleman's
up another
time
one.
has expired, but I will pick up on that very thread to begin. This sets up a sub-account. It's drawn from OCS and mining lease funds that right now are supporting the federal treasury. We've got a projected deficit next year of well over $900 billion. This is about 1% of that deficit. Is this the right time to put a further strain on the treasury?
Mr. Chairman, if you'd let me, I want to just read a paragraph that addresses the underlying funding question so I get the numbers precisely right, then go to the more philosophical point that you're raising. This act would direct a portion of revenues from oil and gas and mineral extraction for wildlife conservation and what's called the Wildlife Conservation and Restoration Program. Half the funds, $650 million, would come from existing revenues from energy development on the outer continental shelf, and the other $650 million would come from existing revenues from mineral development on federal lands, and we do know that these are expanding. I've had this conversation with Secretary Zinke, who's also looking for a constructive way to dedicate some of those funds toward his own backlog of maintenance in the national park system. But while we're doing this, to the point philosophically, what a more constructive initiative, in my mind, to take the resource recovery, the trust that we are gaining from resource extraction and moving it back into resource recovery, again, for the benefit of community.
It's not philosophy, it's simple accounting. This is 1% of the entire deficit we'll be carrying.
You could look at it that way, too, but I'm trying to be a little more graceful. So, again, approaching the idea that we control these funds, and I'm interested in good public policy, and the potential cost savings that comes from the prevention of the invoking of the endangered species is tremendous, along with the potential opportunity that these gentlemen have been talking about increased recreational hunting and sportsman activity.
Let me raise one other concern, and that is there's a provision in the bill that basically provides these funds even if no public access is allowed to these public lands. Now, that may not be a concern in Nebraska, but in a state like California that treats hunters and fishers as second-class citizens, that's a huge problem. One of the principal objectives of this subcommittee is to restore public access to the public lands. Providing funding to states from this source to states that have cut off access to the public lands is a concern. Could you address that?
Not to the specifics of the situation in California. I know from my own experience in Nebraska, we approach this in a collaborative manner. We're looking for voluntary landowner agreements. We're looking to meet the multiple objectives of both species and habitat preservation, but also increasing the opportunities for appropriate harvesting and recreational land use. So sometimes those things, because of the delicate nature of the ecosystem, do conflict. A lot of the times, they may not. So again, this is, I can't speak to the specifics of your state, but the ethos where I live, and I think in a lot of places, I think, is to look at this holistically.
Great, thank you. That concludes my questions. Ms. Hanabusa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman,